Thanks everyone so much for the interest and the attendance here. It sounds like there's still a line, one in, one out kind of thing. So again, appreciate the enthusiasm. We are here to talk about Process Builder or Process Builder versus Apex triggers, depending on how you want to look at it. Just guidelines around choosing between process automation tools. We'll get into discussions around visual workflow a little bit as well as it relates to point and click process automation concepts, but mostly just want to kind of highlight some key capabilities around Process Builder, talk through some scenarios where it makes sense to do one versus the other, and talk about kind of the lines around, the boundaries around levels of complexity that ultimately help us make the right decisions in this space. Quick intro to me. So I'm Nick Cook. I'm a director with Salesforce in our App Cloud and Architecture Specialists group, which means I've spent the majority of my time past couple of years as a charter member of our Accelerators program, for folks that are familiar with that. It's allowed me to engage somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 customers during that time across topics from doing architecture assessments to technical debt assessments, other engagements around governance, release management, and of course, process automation type topics like we're here to discuss today. I've been in and around Salesforce as a technology platform for about 10 years now. Was a developer on several other platforms prior to that. A fairly active Trailhead zealot, as you may expect in and around this conference. I expect there are many in the audience here as well. Got 18 core certifications on the platform, which generally leads to permanent head damage. I'm not entirely sure I recommend taking it that far. But that includes the Platform Developer 2 certification, some of those from our new Architect Academy track, which has its own kind of series of side effects and ailments that come with it. Prior to working with Salesforce, I was in the implementation consulting game for several years and spent some time around some enterprise IT shops as well on various CRM, sales automation platforms, homegrown solutions, things like that. So enough about me for the moment anyway. I guess to get to know the room a little bit better, so how many folks here would classify themselves as admins or advanced admins in that space? Most. How about developers? Some overlap too. I respect that. I read the fence. Advanced developers, folks that are professional code, just love to write code, do all that stuff. A couple, yeah. All right. A good handful. Good to know. So, as I mentioned, it wouldn't be a Salesforce presentation without a safe harbor statement. So we sell lots of stuff. I may talk about some other stuff. I may not. Please make investing and purchasing decisions only on the first thing, not the second thing. Thank you. From an agenda, I should make my own slide. No, legal wouldn't like that. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to talk Process Builder overview a little bit, Process Builder benefits, when not to use Process Builder and the considerations therein. And then we'll go through some example scenarios and varying levels of complexity around some of the scenarios with Process Builder and Apex triggers, some limitations, best practices, and then some non-technical considerations that sometimes key into the decision-making process as well. How many folks have used Process Builder pretty extensively? How many people have gotten mad at it while you're doing that? So that's not possible. People who have used it, there were more people who've been mad at it than people who have used it. So that's a lie. Okay, that's not true. I understand. How many folks have kind of paid attention to kind of its evolution over time, right? So from summer 15 to the new stuff that's been added, better bulkification capabilities, all that stuff. Okay. All right. I certainly do run into some folks who tried it 2 years ago and thought, ugh, and never went back. So we'll talk through some of the reasons to not think about it that way as well. So as I mentioned, Process Builder has been around a couple of years now. It's certainly come a fair way since then. The concept and principle, obviously, advanced business process logic without code. Maybe a more organized, intuitive mechanism than traditional, or what I like to call legacy workflow. I don't know if that's a sanctioned term or not. Knowing that the former workflow capabilities, the older, more seasoned workflow capabilities can be pretty difficult to manage end to end. When you go and look at all of your 50 workflows on your case object and you have no idea the degree of overlap between them or the order in which they execute on any given save operation, consolidation of actions that happen on the back end. Again, the principle behind Process Builder certainly has been to help clarify that, right? To be able to look in a code base and a well-structured, well-architected trigger structure to be able to look in Process Builder and at least maybe be able to see in two places. These are the decision criteria, the major functions that happen in and around any given object. That's a little bit idealistic, I realize. But again, out of the gate, right, some very traditionally code-based scenarios that were covered initially, with the exception of some of the admitted and aforementioned bulkification challenges. But again, largely give organizations the ability to deprecate some of the actions from traditional workflow when it comes to task creation and email sending, field updates, things like that, and then replicating some of those common trigger use cases. As I mentioned, right, the concepts of record creation and related record creation were part of that as well. The ability to post to chatter with a degree of logic involved and a degree of specificity, certainly part of that initial core capability. And then approval submissions as well, right? So based on criteria, being able to initiate approval processes without the button click. Some people like the button click, right? As the evolution progressed, right, we've seen additional things, and this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but the ability to initiate quick actions, the ability to do chaining of processes, process invocation, invocating Apex, invoking flow from Process Builder processes, additional and/or conditional logic. That was a big one for me, being able to play with criteria at each step to be able to kind of make it more of a swim lane experience as opposed to a one path and done execution. And then obviously a lot of work, under the covers behind the scenes when it comes to enhanced bulkification to support more of those complex, trigger type scenarios. So I tend to categorize this into 4 bullet points and then split that into 2 categories as well. I'm a huge fan of dichotomy, obviously. Use cases around collaboration, communication, again, sending email, doing chatter posts, being able to automate some of those processes, those activities on a criteria-based basis. Productivity management as well, so the concept of task creation. Pretty low-hanging fruit when it comes to the Process Builder world, right? When you start to think about the bottom section here, and that's why there's a little warning sign down there, when you start to think about data manipulation and really advanced process logic, process invocation, even more so based on the keynote today and the ability to invoke a platform event from a Process Builder process. It would have been nice to know that was in the keynote before I put these slides together. But when you get into areas like that, you can do more stuff, but you can also get yourself into more trouble, right? And the key with process automation on Force.com is minimization of complexity and marrying your automation choices with core competencies of your delivery team or of your organization as a whole, and we'll talk more about that. So why Process Builder? I alluded to this a little bit already, but the required skill set is a big driver, right? If my voice is hoarse, it's because I've been manning the consultation stand most of the day today. And I've seen a lot of folks come in and say, hey, we don't have any developers. We don't have any coders. We need to do as much declaratively, configuratively as possible. And one of the nice folks who came in to talk through that opened up a visual workflow that had like 80 decision criteria in it. And I think, you think that's non-complex, right? That's probably 150 lines of code there, right? How is 150 lines of code less complex than how is it more complex than a massive spider web of visual workflow, right? So something to think about, but required skill set is often a piece of that drives folks to use these types of capabilities. Likewise, speed to deliver. Maybe there's a lot of governance process around code in your organization, stringent review processes, or it falls into a different change request bucket in your release management process if it involves code. So to get it into the 2-week maintenance window instead of the 6-week maintenance window, it's got to be declarative. Like, that's a reason. Ease of maintenance, again, with an asterisk, because not always, and we'll talk more about that. But certainly the perception that it's easier to maintain or more flexible to maintain, certainly a little bit debatable. Supportability, likewise, right? This, again, loops back a little bit to skill set required. And then performance, with a question mark, right? It depends what you're doing. And again, a lot of the concepts that we're going to talk about today, relate back to complexity when it comes to how to make good choices. So why not Process Builder? Governance and oversight can be a part of it. Like I mentioned, maybe you're rules and regulations and compliance around your org dictate that if it involves critical path process logic, it needs to go through, all of the regulatory compliance-related bodies to get to production, and that process is only enforced for things that are deemed code-related, right? So either you start labeling process builder processes as code-related, or you just don't do them in process builder and you continue to write code. Logic consolidation is a part of it, so I spent some time as a Force.com consultant with a large social media organization, and they kind of made the decision, we like to be able to go to one spot and see all of the activities that are, all of the methods that are functioning in and around a given object. And they had a well-formed trigger architecture that was, one trigger per object. For each DML operation, here are the methods that occur, and you could pretty easily dictate the order that things were happening, that you were handling recursion properly. Some of the developers in the room are going, yeah, okay. And what they were finding was they were constantly battling issues with their continuous delivery process when some declarative workflow change would cause a problem with the logic that was being processed in the trigger base. It was unpredictable due to order of operations issues, and they just said, you know what, we're just gonna write code for all of it. And they did it in a way that, abstracted a lot of the logic into custom metadata types and things like that so that you could still make a reasonable degree of logic change without a deployment, and it worked for them. But core competency in that organization was engineering, right? Everybody was a coder. Product managers and project managers were coders, right? So it's something that worked. I certainly don't advocate everybody going out and doing that, but a lot of code or an implementation doesn't necessarily mean a ratty implementation, right? Reliability, comfortability. Again, organizations that know code and are good at code and have lived by code tend to stick with code. And then performance, if you've got a well-formed trigger architecture and you're only fetching data when you need to, it can be very, very performant. I've been around, I've done technical debt assessments with orgs that had their Apex code character limit tripled and quadrupled, and their implementations were still performant. Looking at the metrics on the back end, things were still running smooth, but they were doing things very well and very purposefully. So again, performance with a question mark. So we're going to go through some more specific scenarios, and I'll try to talk through some even more specific use cases of some of these scenarios to kind of evaluate decision criteria between process builder processes and triggers. All right. So scenario number one, populating a lookup field based on a record update. Seems like pretty low-hanging fruit, right? The classic, basic use case that folks always wanted, the massive idea exchange, thumbs up, essentially cross-object workflow, right, in a sense. Based on record criteria on the current record, being to populate a lookup field on that same object. So let's say you want to set a field on an opportunity that's a lookup to a user called like a big deal support resource or a big deal support manager, something like that. You set entry criteria for process builder to, amount greater than $1 million or $100,000 or whatever it is for your organization, and maybe a specific product category from a custom field, and that's your entry criteria for a process builder process. And you set the lookup to that custom lookup field to the proper person, the VP of big deals, whatever the case might be. That's pretty great, pretty low-hanging fruit. Not the most complex trigger to write at all, but a pretty great, low-hanging fruit use case for process builder. If we take that example a little bit further, and I will with the next example, but again, if you've got multiple layers of lookup logic, you're having to traverse across, multiple related objects, nested maps, and a bunch of loops and things like that in a trigger, you're probably not going to be able to do that in process builder, right? Maybe a process builder process that invokes a flow or invokes an Apex class, something like that. But again, when you're trying to balance complexity, may not be the best fit. So to highlight that point a little bit more, the concept of like setting record ownership based on certain criteria. So something that wasn't part of Process Builder out of the gate, but is part of Process Builder now, as of winter 17, I believe. So a little bit similar to the lookup field scenario, but there are definitely some nuances to this particular idea. So let's say you want to set the owner on a custom object, like a work order object in a field service implementation, something like that. And you want to set that owner based on a combination of account geography, or the skill sets on a different custom object related to the work order itself or work order line items. So you're moving sideways and up and down in terms of data fetching to figure out all of the components. Again, you could possibly do that in a process builder process with, again, layers deep, process builder inception, keep going further into flow and things like that. And a person with the right skill set could probably do that in a really complex scenario in a day or two. But again, an experienced developer can probably write a trigger at that level of complexity in less than 100 lines or 200 lines, something like that. And how long does it take you to write 200 lines of code? Yeah, right? So, and how long does that take? Right. So again, he said, so the answer was it's probably 100 lines and it's probably 2 hours, right? Your project manager is going to love you because you're going to have to write a unit test for that, right? Okay. And you're going to use asserts and you're not going to use CL data. We're just making sure. Okay, good. But again, to simply say, let's set the owner of this work order based on, I don't know, account zip or let's say central versus east versus west, and those are all fields that are accessible on this hypothetical work order object. That's pretty easy to do in Process Builder, but to take it that further example and say it's a combination of geo, skill, and availability, again, something that could theoretically be done, but in code it's probably faster. And again, if you're holding elements of the logic of your conditional statements from the code in a metadata type or in a custom setting, again, you don't necessarily lose configurability. So another scenario, so posting to Chatter. Post to a Chatter feed based on certain record criteria. You're going to sense a theme here. So again, let's say, for example, every deal over $100,000, every opportunity over $100,000 needs to post to Chatter and mention the VP of sales. Wants top-down visibility to all of that. Super, super simple in Process Builder. Let's say every deal over 100,000 for a specific product line, and again, that's a field in the opportunity, needs to go to a specific product manager and mention that person in Chatter. Again, pretty easy, just more swim lanes in your Process Builder process based on that product category. Then let's take it a step further and say, let's say every deal over 100,000 with a product line item in a certain category within a certain time frame on a project schedule needs to go to a specific product group. Now we're under some gray area when it comes to complexity, right? Again, things that can be done through some pretty complex spider webs, or maybe they can't, depending on what the specific criteria is. But again, reduction of complexity tends to dictate that something like that, even though the core the basis of the use case, the basis of the requirement is similar, depending on the details and how granular you need to get in terms of specifying that post and targeting it, it could mean making the opposite decision. Go through a couple of more. Got a few minutes here. The red clock's not yelling at me yet. So in this scenario, right? So a submission of a quote for approval based on an opportunity stage. So a nuance here is that the criteria lives on the opportunity and the action itself lives on the quote. So this is also possible through Process Builder, but it may involve multiple processes. So first, you need a process that updates the quote based on the opportunity stage and sets a criteria that dictates that it's ready for submission. And then you would have a separate Process Builder process that, based on the field update on the quote, submits it for approval when the criteria are met. So again, a fairly tidy example of how to do that. Again, complex logic could certainly dictate that, like, for example, examining product line items on the opportunity to dictate a specific approval process. Things like that could muddy the water. But again, a little bit more robust scenario for Process Builder where you're able to string a couple of processes together, not necessarily together, but use several across different objects as part of a more holistic end-to-end process. So another scenario that calls out a really specific capability, and that's the concept of cloning a record and modifying its field values. So something that is probably done in an Apex controller on a custom page sometimes, or on an action button on a standard page layout, but could also be done conditionally in logic based on like, let's say maybe when an opportunity is closed won, you automatically clone it and create the renewal opportunity for a year later, or for 6 months later, or whatever the case might be. So This is a scenario for a trigger at this point. There's not a great solution for this in Process Builder. The new record creation can obviously be handled, and you can specify field values, but if you need to make references to the prior field values, the initiating record in the cloning process, you're run into challenges, and that capability is certainly limited. So again, could possibly be done through a combination of Process Builder and Flow, but is a use case that typically lives and thrives in code a little bit more effectively. So, having gone through some scenarios and a backdrop on Process Builder and not Process Builder, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the limitations at play that dictate some of these complexity boundaries that I've been trying to articulate. Keywords trying. So as I've mentioned, right, the underlying theme, path forward often relying on complexity. You could argue that complex logic can be easier to build and maintain in code, to be able to say, okay, if you're organizing your conditionals in an effective manner, if you're abstracting logic, conditional logic where you can, into other mechanisms in the application, you can certainly argue that you're not losing flexibility on the code side. You could argue certainly as well that rapid iteration or maturity level of a process is a concern in one area of the other, or the other. So, the concept of versioning and deployment so those of you who got mad at Process Builder, for how many of you was it because you struggled to for example, you can't deploy an active one and you run into challenges with that? Yeah. Okay, so really, really rapid iteration as part of a deployment process can be a challenge. The metadata API limitations around Process Builder processes can be a reason. I've had organizations that had really strong, continuous integration, continuous delivery processes, not DX obviously, but other processes hooked up ran into challenges with Process Builder processes because they break their continuous deployment mechanisms, right? Can certainly be a consideration as well. The last bullet point here that I want to talk about too is unit test considerations. So I worked with an organization last year and the year before through the Accelerator program, doing technical debt assessments and things like that kind of had gone all in Process Builder when it first launched and was trying to they had a ton of code, a lot of logic, definitely some stuff that could have been done in legacy workflow that was living in triggers, but they were hitting workflow limits on a lot of their key objects as well. So in lieu of being able to do that, they were writing code for really, really simple stuff, and they had some great use cases that fit the mold for Process Builder processes. But what they quickly found, and it was a high availability application, what they quickly found is that they'd actually done a really, really good job as an organization on unit testing concepts. So, liberal use of system asserts, using run as, componentizing unit tests to simulate real system and user processes and outcomes. The degree to which that they felt pretty good that if they executed or run all tests and didn't have any failures, that they weren't breaking anything that was going to stop somebody's ability to do their jobs, right? So a shining use case for how to do unit tests properly. When they deprecated a bunch of code, they deprecated a bunch of unit tests around those processes, and the new Process Builder processes that replaced that code didn't have that mechanism to safeguard them, and they broke stuff over and over again. So in organizations like that, where you've got critical path processes, living in point-and-click space, there's no reason you can't write a unit test against that and assert the outcome of an operation, right? You don't have to cover code, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. And some folks have definitely, realized that the hard way. So I won't labor too long on platform limits around Process Builder. A couple of key ones to think about though: the number on any of active rules and plus processes on a given object, number of flows plus processes total, active total, criteria node limits executed at runtime. Again, some pretty lofty limits towards the bottom of this page, but a handful, towards the top that are worth thinking about. Some relatively simple stuff here, but again, criteria nodes in a given process is an important one to think about. And I think the idea behind this, right, is just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should when it comes to these limits. If you're talking about, what's feasible, you may be well beyond the point of what's advisable. So that's something to certainly consider. And then a handful of other considerations, right? So other factors It's 3 C's by pure coincidence. I am a huge fan of alliteration, but it wasn't intentional. Capabilities, culture, and criticality, right? So a little bit in the example I used earlier, organizational strengths matter, right? If you're an organization that's really good at code and has a bunch of really good developers and you move quickly and don't break things when you use code as an automation mechanism, then okay, it's fine. I don't know if it's going to get me fired to not stand here and say clicks before code, always, 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 but certainly, again, organizational strengths, capabilities matter. Maturity level of your capabilities and of the platform capability itself certainly matters. Apex has been around a long time. And as I mentioned too, high code volume doesn't necessarily equate to low performance or necessarily high complexity if things are architected and designed in an effective and flexible way. I would love to do a session on that. I actually am doing a session later on decluttering your Salesforce org over in the campfire, so shameless plug for that. We'll certainly talk about technical debt identification and remediation there that can help in the complex code space. So culture, I mentioned, high compliance organizations sometimes choose to limit the level of capability to which admins have been blessed in a given scenario. Again, enforcing that certain decision criteria or levels of complexity go through channels that often dictates code or dictates a longer support and maintenance process, really common in healthcare, financial services organizations where there may be a lot of visibility into what's a major request versus what's a minor request and the level of governance that goes in and around those things. Which bleeds a little bit more into the criticality piece as well. The example that I mentioned about unit tests, and if you've got test automation, for which I have a session tomorrow, talking about your ability to test and monitor complex processes to make sure that you're and again encouraging you to actually run tests in a non-production deployment scenario, or to run tests as we saw in the keynote demo within your Scratch org. To make sure you're not breaking stuff in real time. The sooner you've broken something, the probably less hazardous it is to unwind stuff and fix it. But again, having that mechanism to lean on, knowing that it's predicated upon doing a good job with your unit tests anyway, is an important one and can be an important decision criteria. Again, highly recommend that if you're doing really complex stuff through declarative process automation mechanisms, having admins that are doing that stuff pair with a developer to write a unit test to verify it, if it's at all important or critical to a core process. Want to spend a few minutes at the end here directing attention towards where to do more, where to think about more stuff. If you haven't checked out the Success Journey Hub, salesforce.com/getting started, categorized by product cloud, by app cloud, by a series of things. You can find great resources there. So hopefully we're all familiar with Trailhead. That's one of the reasons that we're here. But the degree to which it is much easier through the Success Journey Hub to find white papers, to find videos, webinars, to find circles of success that are great intros to a lot of interesting topics. And then for those of you that are in the Premier Plus signature success space, figuring out for a given subject area, accelerators that make sense, to get, multi-time certified experts in to talk about a specific subject area to help drive and maintain that further. Some additional, references here, some specifics in that space, related to Trailhead, to circles of success, to accelerators. And again, it's some of the topics that I've mentioned here aside from process automation, like the ability to manage a system development lifecycle, ALM capabilities that provide you the ability to go fast, concepts like test automation. Wanted to drill some deeper dive resources here to talk about some things like that. I left myself 10 minutes, just like I said I would. These guys weren't pointing at the sign though, like they said they would. Yeah, we're here. Yeah, so the question is about performance considerations of process builders versus triggers. And again, it's hard to answer because it totally depends. I mean, my experience certainly earlier on with process builder on complex transactions, I thought it was performing worse, right? It's a little bit anecdotal. I did run some queries for some customers that kind of proved it out, but I think part of the spirit of this, right, is if you're using the right automation mechanism for the right thing, good performance is going to come with that, right? So if you're trying to be too complex and you're nesting process builder processes through to workflow processes through to Apex and then back, certainly can be a risk, right? Yeah.
I know the living in process builder, but why do you need to change the API of a field that doesn't feed to your active process builder or update like it does everywhere else? Is it because it's active and it can't stop what it's doing to update?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So the question, make sure I paraphrase it correctly here, is why you need to version a process essentially to.
Usually things. So I found out the hard way. Like I was like, yeah, I'll change that field name to
Right.
field.
Right.
Because I didn't realize that since it's active, it's essentially locked in.
Right, yeah. So an active process that's being executed can't necessarily be modified as quickly or in as agile a fashion as you want for exactly the reason that you're pointing out, because it's running, it could be executing, right? So,
Would it in a trigger?
yeah, because triggers are point in time with the transaction as well, right? So you probably have to execute a deployment, right, to update a trigger in a production org. You can't just make a change, right? So if I'm going to finger wag you for doing admin changes directly in production, that's a different conversation. What's the sandbox, she said. That's good. We have some campfire sessions about that, too. Right over here. So you and then you. There are transactional differences, right? There are smaller transactional differences if your triggers are well written and well bulkified. As of the release previous winter back, when the bulkification capabilities around Process Builder got a lot better, the Process Builder process is smart enough to, like, for example, bundle SOCL statements together when they're fetching like data, right? So the limit around 100 SOCL queries that a lot of folks ran into with Process Builder in the early days is kind of handled automatically. And if your code stinks, it's not handled, right? So it goes back to capabilities a little bit, but in theory, if both things are done well, there's very little difference. So to execute the same thing, the same concept, yeah. Yeah. Oh, what a great point. So running into basically governor limits when you've got a well-bulkified trigger running as well as a process builder process, and it's super hard to debug. And yeah, you're totally right. It's super hard to debug. Right? So great observation. Actually, I have a consultation booth session later. If you want to bring it by, we can look at it. Okay. Yeah, we're there and over there and there.
Speak to performance on creating one process builder for your entire per object versus creating multiple processes for the same object.
Yeah. So performance-wise, I don't know that it matters, right? It's not always going to be possible, like from a consolidation process, to get to like the holy grail one process builder process. Not just because of the number of decision criteria, but needing to execute like multiple swim lanes and do things like that. I like to look at it as more of like a supportability, maintainability aspiration, right? To be able to say, here's the bulk of what's happening, but it could be similar in a sense, like if you've got a trigger that's essentially calling a bunch of helper handler methods elsewhere, you could look at Process Builder the same way. Like, here are my Process Builder processes, 4 or 5 for an object, and each one is executing on a specific task or a specific realm or a specific piece of functionality. Sometimes that's a better way to break it up. But it's nonlinear, right? So those processes could run in parallel and be just as fast start to finish to kind of answer the performance question. You had a question too.
Yeah, so related to that, monitoring SOCL limits, if it's across process builders and triggers, would you do debug logs, unit testing?
Yeah, I mean, debug logs are probably your best bet, but the degree to which I honestly can't speak to the degree to which, step by step, how granular that is in a debug log. Clearly not granular enough for the guy over there, but yeah, that's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
Will unit tests along with process is deploy the process builder, then deploy the tests, but potentially you're missing out if you fail the test as you deployed it. Is there a better way to approach that?
There's not really a better way. No, I mean, I like that. I like the mindset, right? So the question is, when it comes to deploying process builder processes and deploying and executing tests, is there a, pre-diagnosed best way to handle that? And, I think obviously, if you're leveraging a unit test process, as you should, as I mentioned, to qualify actual outcomes of process automation, then obviously you need to kind of do it the way you're doing it, right? Let's see if this process builder process impacts the tests I'm trying to execute. Mostly I just love that you're running them when you might not have to, so that's good. Yeah.
Inherited report with tens of triggers, the opportunity also
Oh no.
workflows,
Yeah.
a lot of things I want to migrate into process builder if they can.
Sure.
Is there a best practice?
Yeah. Yep, so if it doesn't have it already, at some point soon, the org optimizer tool is gonna show you like overlapping entry criteria to workflow rules. And that's a great place to start identifying candidates to move to process builder, right? So I would start with those use cases. Like look at what you've got in legacy workflow today, start with those use cases for process builder, and then start to look to deconstruct triggers where you can. Parallel path, start to consolidate those 10 opportunity triggers into one. Refactor the code, refactor the legacy workflow, and then look at automation mechanism next. That's what I would do. But you should definitely come to the decluttering your Salesforce org campfire this afternoon. Yeah.
So what time are you doing your consultation with?
Probably for, so I have to go call my wife. And then I'll probably be over by the consultation booths. So maybe like an hour from now. Yeah.
I have a question. So now for pickless values, you have to have the API with no spaces for like an underscore. So would you advise for process builder any old pickless values that don't have that?
Oh man.
Correct that. I'm just wondering if one day process builder will on me.
I would, yeah. I would if you can handle that proactively. I would suspect that older API versions would still work, right? So if you're not, and I don't know that for a fact, so right. If in theory, if you're running on an older API version, the older API version's rules will apply, but that's not. It's almost always true, but it's an element of technical debt, right? And you can handle it when you know about it, and it's not a problem, or you can handle it when you have to handle it. So. I would look at it sooner rather than later. You had a question.
Follow-up question again. So
Yeah.
we did see issues when you have a trigger on a workflow. So would you advise moving all the logic to trigger if that's the case? Would you advise that's a better option than having it in both places?
Depends the degree to which it's a problem, right? Again, if you're an organization that's super, super good at code and your code is well organized and performant, then I don't have a problem with all of the logic living there. I would say like some of the softer use cases for process builder and for workflow, like sending emails or writing chatter posts, simple field updates, like that stuff can live there without much risk. But when you start to getting into more advanced like data manipulation, then you start to run into like order of operations problems. Does that make sense?
Like let's say there's big data manipulation, I have trigger for it.
Yeah.
And then comes a new small requirement to update a field.
Yeah.
Do that in process builder. But would you advise to use the process builder or write that also into the trigger?
It's not a simple question. I mean, if there's a trigger that's in and around the same set of functionality already, then maybe that's pretty low-hanging fruit, right? And it's an easy thing to do. Put it this way. If there's a spot in your trigger base that's already doing a bunch of criteria-based field updates and it's adding one line, yeah, okay, easy. If your release management process dictates that you can't make a code change, even one line, but once a quarter, and you can make a declarative change every 2 weeks, that changes the answer, right? We don't want to throttle agility of the platform for the sake of tidiness, I guess. So, other questions? I have 11 seconds left. Yeah.
Any performance issue when we use process builders for Salesforce One mobile applications?
No. Totally separate. Both run on the app server. from an infrastructure standpoint, so it doesn't run on the client. Be no different. Awesome. Thanks, folks. Appreciate all the questions. Appreciate the attendance.